Have you ever looked in the back of your closet, seen a pair of shoes you literally haven't worn in like 3 years, and just found yourself physically incapable of throwing them away?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Or, maybe you've stayed in a relationship that you just knew was going nowhere simply to avoid the discomfort of actually ending it.
Right. Or think about this one. Have you ever felt a genuine, totally irrational spike of panic when a 7-day free trial for some app you barely even use is about to expire?
Yes. It is a very specific, deeply ingrained kind of anxiety that honestly almost everyone experiences. But very few people actually start to examine it.
Exactly. So today, our mission on this deep dive is to put that exact feeling under the microscope. We are exploring this invisible psychological force that just dictates our financial decisions, our romantic lives, and shockingly, even our relationship with the truth.
Yeah, we have a really massive stack of research to pull from today, don't we?
We do. It's huge. We're looking at Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's foundational 1979 paper on prospect theory, for starters.
Yeah.
Then we have a fascinating neurological study from the journal PNAS involving rare brain lesions.
Right, the brain damage study. That one is incredible.
It's wild. We're also analyzing the disposition effect in stock trading, a psychological breakdown of romantic deal breakers, a Carnegie Mellon study on how we hoard completely useless information.
Like trivia, basically.
Right, useless trivia. And finally, a lead generation agency's internal playbook on marketing psychology.
It's a really wide-ranging stack of sources today, but they all orbit this one central, incredibly powerful phenomenon known as loss aversion.
Right. So let's set the baseline definition right out of the gate, just so we know what we're dealing with. Structurally, like biologically, the pain of losing $50 feels roughly twice as intense as the joy of finding $50.
Yeah, twice as intense. I mean, we're just wired to avoid losses far more aggressively than we are driven to acquire gains.
Which is wild.
It is. And to understand the magnitude of that statement, we really have to look at how this concept absolutely shattered classical economics.
Right, because the old models were totally different.
Exactly. For the longest time, standard economic models operated on this fundamental, unquestioned assumption. They assumed that humans are perfectly rational calculators.
The mythical rational human, right?
Yeah.
Making perfectly logical choices in a total vacuum.
Right. The prevailing theory was that we logically, mathematically weigh costs and benefits to maximize our utility in literally any given situation.
But Kahneman and Tversky came along and basically proved that we are actually predictably irrational. They introduced something called the certainty effect, using what's known as the Allais paradox.
Yeah, the Allais paradox is a great way to visualize this.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you were given a choice. You could take a guaranteed $3,000 right now, no strings attached.
Which sounds pretty good.
Right. Or you can take an 80% chance to win $4,000. Faced with that exact choice, the vast majority of people take the sure $3,000.
Which, mathematically speaking, is completely risk-averse. Because if you calculate the expected value of that gamble like 80% of 4,000, it's $3,200.
Wait, so the math says you should take the gamble.
Exactly. A perfectly rational calculator would take the 80% gamble because the mathematical value is objectively higher. But human beings prefer the certainty of the game.
Okay, but Kaffersman and Tversky then flipped the signs, right? And this is where the classical models just totally fall apart. They asked the exact same people to choose between a guaranteed loss of $3,000 or an 80% chance of losing $4,000.
And suddenly, people become incredibly risk-seeking.
Yeah, they will gladly take the 80% gamble to lose $4,000 just for that tiny 20% sliver of hope that they can avoid the sure loss. They called this the reflection effect.
Right. And it beautifully illustrates that our risk tolerance, it isn't a static personality trait. It actually changes completely depending on the framing of the situation.
Like how the question is asked.
Exactly. The prospect of a certain loss is so psychologically aversive-like, we hate it so much that we will take terrible mathematical odds just to avoid it.
There's another famous example in the research from Kahneman, Netsch, and Thaler. It's about a wine economist.
Oh, the Bordeaux guy.
Yeah, this guy. So he buys a nice bottle of Bordeaux for $10. Years later, the wine appreciates, and it's suddenly worth $200 at auction. The economist flat out refuses to sell his bottle for $200, but, and here's the kicker, he also absolutely refuses to buy a new identical bottle for $200.
Right. And this perfectly captures what they call the endowment effect and the status quo bias.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, status quo bias is our deep-seated preference for things to remain exactly as they are, the current baseline. The traditional economic view says the economist's behavior here is literally impossible.
Impossible because the math doesn't check out.
Exactly. The wine either has a utility of $200 to him or it doesn't. His willingness to buy it and his willingness to sell it should be mathematically identical.
Okay, but wait. Why is the wine economist acting irrationally here? I mean, let me push back on this for a second. If I own a bottle of wine for 10 years, it's not just a generic bottle of fermented grape juice anymore.
Right. It's yours.
Yeah, it's the bottle I kept in my cellar. Doesn't the utility include, like, sentimental value? Or even just the sheer hassle of finding a buyer? I mean, it's like how dropping a $20 bill on the sidewalk ruins your whole week, but finding a 20 is just a momentary thrill.
That's a great analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a completely fair question. But the researchers actually accounted for those variables. It is not actually about sentimentality or transaction costs.
That's not.
No, it is an asymmetry of value in the brain. The research shows that the disutility, so the psychological pain of giving up an object you already own, is fundamentally greater than the utility or the pleasure of acquiring that exact same object.
Oh, wow. So just owning it changes the math in your head.
Exactly. Once it enters your possession, your reference point shifts. You consider yourself a quote-unquote wine owner. Losing it is no longer a neutral transaction. It is registered by your brain as a penalty.
So if this asymmetry of value is really that universal, where it supersedes literal logic, it can't just be a cultural quirk or some learned behavior. I mean, it has to be a biological mechanism.
Oh, it is heavily biological.
Yeah.
And to find exactly where this mechanism lives, we actually have to transition from behavioral economics to hard neuroscience.
Right. This is where that PNAS study comes in, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
Yes, they literally located the physical address of loss aversion in the human brain.
Which is incredible. They looked at two rare patients identified in the study as SM and AP. Both of these individuals suffer from a super rare genetic condition called Urbach-Wiethe disease.
Right, which caused focal bilateral calcification, which is essentially lesions or damage, specifically in their amygdala.
And the amygdala, just for context, is that small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain, right?
Exactly. It's typically known for processing fear and threat detection. It is basically the core of our survival circuitry.
So the researchers wanted to see how a damaged threat detector affects financial logic. They took these two patients, SM and AP, along with a control group of healthy people, and gave them a starting endowment of $50.
Free money, basically.
Right. Then they asked them to play a series of 50-50 coin flip gambles. The potential gains varied from $20 to $50, and the potential losses also varied from $20 to $50.
Now, to set the baseline here, a healthy person usually needs the potential gain to be roughly twice as large as the potential loss to even consider accepting a 50-50 coin flip.
Because of the twice as intense rule we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So if you tell a healthy control they might lose $20, they want the chance to win at least $40 to make the psychological risk worth it.
But the patients with the amygdala lesions completely defied that norm.
They did.
As long as the math was in their favor, or even just mathematically neutral, they took the bets. Patient AP became completely loss neutral, and patient SM actually became mildly loss-seeking.
But the crucial part is they weren't just randomly gambling out of confusion, They retained a totally normal response to rewards and risk variance.
Right, they still preferred larger gains to smaller ones.
Yeah, and they still disliked wild, unpredictable variance. The only thing that was eliminated was their specific, magnified aversion to loss.
Okay, so their fear was just gone.
Right. What's fascinating here is that it proves loss aversion is essentially a basic Pavlovian approach avoidance response. The amygdala acts as an automatic cautionary brake on our behavior.
Wow, a cautionary brake.
Yeah. When it senses a potential loss, even a purely abstract financial one, it triggers a warning signal that overrides our higher-order rational math processing. Without the amygdala functioning normally, that cautionary brake is just removed entirely.
So I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around this mechanism. It's almost like having a smoke detector in your house that is calibrated so sensitively that it shrieks every single time you make toast.
That is exactly it.
Right, like it's incredibly annoying and it ruins breakfast. But the evolutionary trade-off is that it guarantees you will never, ever burn to death in a house fire. SM&AP basically had the battery taken out of their smoke detector.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The smoke, in this case, is the potential of losing $20, and a healthy amygdala screams as if the entire house is on fire. SM&AP, with the lesion, just saw a piece of toast.
Which leads to a bizarre contradiction, honestly. Are you telling me that literal brain damage made these patients better, more mathematically rational gamblers than Wall Street brokers?
Statistically speaking, yes, because their expected value calculations were entirely unclouded by the fear of losing.
Okay, so how does this oversensitive smoke detector function in an environment where there is no physical fire? Because most of us do have fully functioning amygdalas, and we aren't just, flipping coins in a lab.
Right, we're dealing with real money.
Exactly. Let's look at how this primitive break is applied to modern abstractions, like digital numbers on a screen.
Well, this is where we encounter the disposition effect. It's a behavioral finance term coined by Hersh Shefrin and Meir Statman back in 1985. It describes this incredibly common yet completely disastrous tendency for investors to sell their winning stocks too early and hold on to their losing stocks way too long.
Which is the exact inverse of what literally any financial advisor will tell you to do. I mean, the golden rule is to cut your losers and let your winners ride. So why do our brains compel us to do the exact opposite?
It all comes down to a concept called mental accounting combined with the emotional weight of closing those accounts.
Mental accounting, how does that work?
Think of every stock you buy as opening a separate mental ledger in your head. When you sell a winning stock, you lock in a feeling of pride. You close that specific mental account as a concrete success, which feels great.
Right.
But when you sell a losing stock, you are forced to realize the loss. You have to definitively admit you made a mistake. That triggers the deep psychological pain of regret, which, thanks to the amygdala, we will go to extreme lengths to avoid.
And Terence O'Dean proved the scale of this in a massive 1998 study. He analyzed the trading records of 10,000 discount brokerage accounts over several years.
10,000 accounts, that's a huge sample size.
Huge. And he found that, on average, winning stocks were 60% more likely to be sold than losing ones. The only exception, and I absolutely love this detail, was in December.
Oh, the tax loophole.
Yeah. In December, investors suddenly started selling their losers at a high volume, but only because they needed to claim the tax write-offs before the year ended.
Right, so the pain of paying taxes finally outweighed the pain of admitting a bad trade.
Exactly. The amygdala finally found something it hated more.
And, we shouldn't assume this is just amateur retail investors making emotional mistakes either. The professionals are just as vulnerable to this.
Wait, really? The pros do this too.
Absolutely. There was a study of treasury bond traders at the Chicago Board of Trade. They found that traders take significantly more risk in the afternoon if they suffered losses in the morning.
Oh, I've heard of this. They call it get-evenitis.
Exactly, get Evanitis. They are so desperate to get their daily ledger back to zero, to avoid closing out the day in the red, that they start making wildly irrational, risky bets that they would never, ever make on a normal morning. Mutual fund managers exhibit the exact same bias.
So what does this all mean for the average person listening? If you translate this to everyday life, it's like refusing to fix a leaking roof you tried to patch yourself just so you don't have to look at your spouse and say, I was wrong, I should have hired a professional.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
You'd literally rather watch the water damage spread than actually verbalize the loss of your own competence.
Because the avoidance of regret is consistently a more powerful motivator than the pursuit of success.
Okay, now, if we apply this mental ledger of risk to something even more primal than money, we arrive at, well, biological wealth. Genetics, mate selection.
Yes.
Let's look at how loss aversion dictates romance.
This takes us to a really fascinating analysis in psychology today. When we think about dating, we like to construct this nice narrative that we are searching for our perfect match, the mythical prince or princess.
Right, the fairy tale.
But psychologically and evolutionarily, that is not the primary drive at all. When people are dating, they are desperately, rigorously scanning for deal breakers.
Because once again, losses loom larger than gains.
Mm-hmm.
In the mating market, a negative trait heavily outweighs a positive one.
Exactly.
You can meet someone who is funny, incredibly attractive, they have a great job, but if they are rude to the waiter, the threat detector goes off and you are immediately out.
And evolutionarily, this asymmetry makes perfect sense. The cost of a bad mate choice was historically catastrophic. This is especially true for women due to the biological asymmetry of offspring investment.
Right, the stakes are just physically higher.
Exactly. The time, energy, and literal physical risk required to bear and raise a child meant that choosing a poor partner was a monumental biological loss. Therefore, we evolved a hypersensitive threat detector specifically tuned to screen out bad traits, rather than just welcoming good ones.
The Psychology Today source actually listed specific deal breakers that trigger this threat response today. At the very top of the list for both genders, being disheveled and being lazy.
Which signal a lack of capability.
Right. But here's the one that really stood out to me. Being too quiet is at the absolute bottom of the deal breaker list. In fact, talking too much is actually considered a much bigger risk. Why is that? Because, my first instinct is that someone who doesn't talk might be hiding something.
It has to do with how the brain processes predictability. Excessive talking is often viewed by the brain as a potential threat. It's a sign of instability or a lack of social calibration or just unpredictability. It leaks way too much chaotic information.
I see.
Quietness, on the other hand, is generally processed as a blank slate. It's neutral. It just doesn't trigger the amygdala's warning system in the same way erratic, loud behavior does.
Okay, that makes sense. But the ultimate consequence of all this romantic loss aversion is complete paralysis. The fear of regret keeps people tethered to the status quo.
Which means they don't take action.
Yeah, meaning people will stay in incredibly mediocre, totally unfulfilling relationships because they fear the loss of companionship, or they will stay single forever because they fear the potential pain of a new relationship failing.
And this raises an important question for all of us. How many opportunities in your own life have you passed up simply because the potential downside felt artificially heavier than the upside? The mechanism designed to keep you safe from a catastrophic mate choice is now actively preventing you from taking a chance on a potentially great one.
Wow. So we naturally guard our money, and we naturally guard our genetic potential in dating. But do we hoard abstract concepts?
Oh, we definitely do.
This leads us to a Carnegie Mellon study that shows we actually hoard non-instrumental, totally useless information exactly like we hoard physical objects.
This is a remarkable study by Litovsky and colleagues. They wanted to know if the endowment effect, what we saw with the wine economist, applied to pure knowledge.
Right.
So they gathered participants and gave them random, objectively useless trivia facts. For example, they'd ask, which U.S. state forbids sharing Netflix passwords? Or which language has no separate words for hands or feet?
By the way, the Netflix state is Tennessee, and the language is presumably something incredibly obscure, but the point the researchers are making is that this is non-instrumental information.
Exactly. It doesn't help you survive. It doesn't build shelter. It doesn't make you money. It is useless.
Yeah.
So in the experiment, they endowed people with the expectation of learning 3 specific facts. Then they offered them a gamble. You can keep your 3 facts for sure, or you can flip a coin. Heads, you learn 6 facts. Tails, you lose your original 3 and learn absolutely nothing.
And predictably, because they were endowed with the 3 facts, they completely refused the gamble. They became incredibly reluctant to risk, quote-unquote, losing them.
Right, the endowment effect in action.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The researchers changed how the missing facts were visually represented on the page.
Visual framing.
Yeah. When the missing information was covered by a thick black redaction line, like a classified government document, people became significantly more risk-seeking to uncover it. But when it was just a blank underline, framing it as a gain of new information, they didn't care nearly as much.
Because the redaction line frames the information as something that already exists, but is being actively withheld or taken away from you. It frames it as a loss.
But why? How does the brain link pure information to physical ownership?
Well, when you are endowed with a fact, or even just the promise of a fact, it becomes part of your cognitive map. It integrates into your sense of knowing the world. Taking it away feels like literal theft.
Wow.
The thick black redaction line is a visual cue of a possession being withheld. A blank underline is just a missed opportunity. It proves that we don't just hold on to beliefs because they are useful. We treat our beliefs, and even random trivia, like cherished physical possessions.
Which honestly explains the sheer ferocity of internet arguments. When you challenge someone's deep-seated belief, you aren't just debating logic in a vacuum. You're essentially walking into their house and asking them to set fire to their own cognitive furniture.
Exactly. The brain defends an idea the exact same way it defends a physical territory.
And because human beings have this massive biological blind spot regarding loss, An entire industry has been built around weaponizing it against us.
Oh, absolutely. Let's look at the digital marketers. We have a strategy guide here from the Lead Alchemist Agency, and reading it is honestly like reading a tactical manual for exploiting the amygdala.
It really is. They break down exactly why software companies, like HubSpot, for example, rely so heavily on free trials.
Yeah.
When you sign up, they don't just give you the basic version, they give you all the premium features.
All right, everything unlocked.
You get used to the advanced dashboards, the custom analytics, all the automated tools. Then day 28 rolls around. The notification doesn't say, upgrade to gain these features. It says, your premium features expire in 3 days.
And this relies entirely on the reference point factor.
Yeah.
Marketers know exactly how to manipulate your baseline. Over those 28 days, your brain fully accepted those premium features as part of your endowment. They became the new status quo.
Yeah.
If the marketers can make you feel like you already own the service, taking it away feels like a penalty. You aren't buying software anymore. You are paying a ransom to get your own tools back.
And e-commerce sites do this relentlessly with scarcity cues. Like you are looking at a pair of headphones on Junia or Amazon,
Yeah.
and right under the price, in glaring red text, it says only 3 left in stock. Now, the source mentioned that this activates both the amygdala and the insula. I know the amygdala is the threat detector we've been talking about, but what is the insula doing in this scenario?
So the insula is a region of the brain heavily involved in processing physical pain and feelings of disgust.
Physical pain.
Yeah. So when you see only 3 left in stock, your brain isn't just worried about missing out on a good deal. The insula is literally simulating the physical discomfort of the loss.
Oh, wow.
The marketing cue is inducing a mild state of physiological distress that can really only be relieved by clicking buy.
That is incredibly manipulative. The agency guide actually highlights a specific Google Ads A/B test that proves how powerful this framing is.
The discount test, right?
Yeah. They ran an ad that said 20% off premium plan, so a standard gain frame. Then they ran an ad that said don't miss out. 20% off ends today, a loss frame.
And the results were drastically different.
Totally different. The loss-framed ad generated a 31% higher click-through rate just by tweaking a few words to tell your brain that a discount was actively being taken away from you.
Now, it is worth noting that the marketing guide does warn its clients about ethical boundaries. It explicitly states that marketers should never use fake scarcity like, a countdown timer that just resets every time you refresh the page.
Right.
Because the psychological pressure of loss aversion is so potent, using it deceptively crosses the line from simple persuasion into outright coercion.
It makes you wonder, though. The next time you see a cart expires in 10 minutes timer on a checkout page, is that just a brand literally trying to stimulate your amygdala and your insula? I mean, the answer is unequivocally yes.
Yes, absolutely. So we've journeyed from the supposedly rational, wine-loving economist deep into the calcified threat centers of the human brain, across the volatile trading floors of Chicago, through the rigorous biological minefield of dating apps, and finally into the highly targeted ads on our phones.
It is everywhere. It dictates so much of our daily friction. But the sources do offer an actionable takeaway, a defense mechanism against our own biology, if you will.
Right. We aren't completely helpless.
No, it's called hedonic framing. Because you now know that your brain mathematically hates losses more than it loves gains, you can consciously trick it. You do this by mentally combining your smaller losses into one big loss.
Give us an example of that.
Like, if you have 3 separate bills to pay them all at exactly the same time. You only pay the amygdala tax once. But conversely, you should separate your gains into multiple small victories so you get a steady, prolonged drip of dopamine.
It is entirely about consciously managing your mental accounting. It requires really recognizing when your fear of loss is a valid protective instinct and when it is just an outdated cognitive illusion that is holding you back from, a good investment, a great relationship, or a new perspective.
But I want to leave you with a forward-looking thought that builds on everything we've unpacked today. We just talked about A/B testing and basic digital marketing. But as artificial intelligence and machine learning become infinitely more sophisticated, what happens when algorithms can perfectly map your personal, individual loss aversion threshold?
That is a terrifying thought.
Imagine a world where every piece of news you read, every dynamic price tag you encounter, and every social media feed is generated in real time to sit exactly on the razor's edge of your brain's specific fear of loss. An algorithm that keeps your amygdala permanently hostage simply because it knows exactly what you personally are most afraid of losing.
Right. A fully personalized, automated threat detector, weaponized at scale.
Something to think about the next time you hesitate to cancel a subscription.
Mm.
Or the next time you look at those shoes in the back of your closet that you know deep down you are never, ever going to wear.